January 14th, 1942. The North Atlantic. Latitude 40 degrees north. Longitude 70 degrees west. The water here is the color of old iron. It is cold in ways that language rarely captures accurately. A cold that does not merely chill the body, but silences something deeper inside it. The wind moves across the surface in long, low sheets, pressing the swells into ridges that rise and fall with the patience of something ancient and utterly indifferent. The sky above holds no color. It is a ceiling of gray wool, stitched tight at every horizon, and beneath it, the ocean goes about its business as it always has, enormous, methodical, and without mercy. Somewhere beneath those gray swells, at a depth of perhaps 40 meters, a German Type 9 U-boat moves in silence. Its hull is painted in the mottled gray of the Kriegsmarine. So its crew of 48 men are pressed into a steel cylinder barely 76 meters long. Men who smell of diesel and machine oil and unwashed clothing. Men who have not felt sunlight on their faces in 11 days. They are not comfortable. They are not romantic. They are soldiers occupying a machine that exists for one purpose and one purpose only: to find ships and send them to the bottom of the sea. But on this particular morning in January 1942, the commander of that U-boat is not thinking about discomfort. He is thinking about opportunity. Because something extraordinary is unfolding around him, something that, in the first weeks of its execution, looks very much like the beginning of the end for the Allied cause in the Atlantic. The United States has entered the war just 37 days ago, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and the American coastline, with its blazing city lights still visible from the surface at night, with its merchant traffic still moving in complacent peacetime patterns, with its navy still scrambling to organize convoy doctrine, is open, wide open, like a door left unlocked by an unsuspecting household. The commander knew it. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of Germany's submarine campaign, had known it before the first torpedo was loaded. He had planned for this moment since the summer of 1941, studying the American Atlantic seaboard on his charts the way a surgeon studies an anatomy. He called the operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat. The name was chosen with intention. A drumbeat is a beginning. It announces what is coming. It is the sound that precedes the march. And in those first weeks, it sounded very much like a symphony. To understand what Dönitz believed he was building, and what the Liberty ship program would ultimately do to his arithmetic, one must first understand the logic of the tonnage war. The Germans called it the Tonnagekrieg, and it was, at its core, an equation. A cold, mechanical calculation that had nothing to do with valor or sacrifice or ideology and everything to do with numbers written in a ledger. The logic was simple, and in the beginning, seductive. Britain and her allies required a constant flow of imported materials to survive: food, fuel, steel, ammunition, machinery. That flow moved almost entirely by sea. If German U-boats could sink Allied merchant vessels faster than Allied shipyards could build replacements, the flow would eventually cease. Britain would be strangled. The Soviet Union, dependent on Allied supply routes for its war-fighting capacity, would collapse under the weight of German pressure. And America, whose entire strategic contribution to the European theater depended on its ability to project men and material across 3,000 miles of open ocean, would find itself unable to act, not because of military defeat, but because there would simply be no ships left to carry the army. Dönitz had calculated, with the precision of a trained naval officer and the confidence of a man who had been building submarines since 1935, that if his U-boats could maintain a rate of sinking 700,000 gross registered tons of Allied shipping per month, The war in the Atlantic would be decided in Germany's favor within 18 months, yet he needed only enough submarines, enough wolves in the pack, and enough time. In 1940 and early 1941, the calculation had seemed to be holding. The months between June 1940 and October 1940, which the U-boat crews themselves would come to refer to with the warmth of soldiers recounting a golden season, were known as the first happy time. The aces of the submarine service, Günther Prien, Joachim Schepke, Otto Kretschmer, had hunted in waters that felt almost undefended. Prien, commanding U-47 and already famous for sinking the British battleship Royal Oak in the protected waters of Scapa Flow, sent Allied ship after Allied ship to the bottom with a terrifying, almost casual efficiency. Kretschmer, the most decorated U-boat commander of the entire war, developed a tactic of attacking convoys from within, surfacing in the dark between the columns of merchant ships, firing at near point-blank range, and slipping away before the escorts could respond. These men became heroes in Germany. Their faces appeared on magazine covers and propaganda posters. Their tonnage scores were reported in German newspapers, the way home runs are reported in American broadsheets. There was a fervor in the submarine service, a sense of destiny at the waterline. But by 1941, the mathematics had begun to assert themselves in a way that Dönitz found unsettling. The British had implemented the convoy system, and convoy routing had become more sophisticated. Aircraft patrols were extending farther over the ocean. The aces, Prien, Schepke, Kretschmer, had been lost or captured within 4 months of each other in the spring of 1941. The U-boat fleet was growing, but the shipping lanes were becoming more dangerous. The monthly tonnage figures were inconsistent, sometimes approaching the required threshold, sometimes falling far short. And then, in December 1941, the United States entered the war. And in Lorient and Brest, in the concrete bunkers where the U-boat arm made its plans, there was something close to celebration. The German Naval Command's assessment of American industrial and military preparedness was not built on ignorance. German intelligence had been observing the United States for years. What they concluded, and what was, in the winter of 1941 and into the first months of 1942, entirely accurate, was that America was militarily unready. The United States Navy had no established convoy system on the eastern seaboard. American coastal cities refused initially to enforce blackouts, arguing that darkened streets would damage the tourist economy. Shipping moved freely, silhouetted against the glow of Miami and Atlantic City and Cape Hatteras, offering German periscope commanders a gallery of targets set against an illuminated backdrop. The sheer luxury of it was almost disorienting. 5 U-boats launched Operation Drumbeat on January 13, 1942. By the end of that first month, they had sunk an astonishing 25 ships totaling 156,939 tons. By February, the monthly totals had climbed further. By the spring of 1942, the carnage along the American coastline had become so severe that the U-boat crews began calling it the second happy time, the zweite glückliche Zeit. And between January and the summer of 1942, Axis submarines sank 609 ships totaling 3.1 million tons, against a loss of only 22 U-boats. The exchange ratio was extraordinary, almost obscene in its one-sidedness. It was not a battle, it was a harvest. In their patrol logs and private correspondence, U-boat commanders described the American coast as a shooting range. The tankers they hunted were fully loaded, riding low in the water, their silhouettes unmistakable. When a torpedo connected, the burning oil spread across the surface, turning the ocean orange for miles. From periscope depth, a commander watching this might believe, with a logic that felt airtight, that what he was witnessing was the gradual dismemberment of the Allied war effort. Every ship that burned was a calculation in his favor. Every column of black smoke rising over the Atlantic horizon was a data point confirming the tonnage war's inevitable conclusion. Donitz studied his weekly figures with the focus of a man reading scripture. In 1942 alone, his U-boats sank 7.8 million tons of Allied shipping, a figure that exceeded Japanese total sinkings for the entire war. The average monthly tonnage through the second half of 1942 hovered near and sometimes above the required threshold. In October 1942, over 600,000 tons went down. The math, as Donitz read it, pointed only one direction. What the German admiral did not know, what his intelligence apparatus had failed to adequately monitor, and what would ultimately shatter the foundations of the tonnage war, was what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic, in a city on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay called Richmond, California. In the early months of 1941, the shoreline of Richmond, California, was a quiet curve of tidal mudflat and sparse industrial yard. The population of the city was modest, its port infrastructure barely worth noting. If you had stood on the shore in January of that year and looked out across the water toward San Francisco, you would have seen a working-class city that expected to remain, for the foreseeable future, exactly what it was: ordinary. By December 1941, that assessment had become obsolete. A man named Henry J. Kaiser had arrived, and with him came something that the German Naval Command had no framework to understand or adequately fear: the productive machinery of American democracy unleashed in total war. Kaiser was not a man who had come from the shipbuilding tradition. He was a contractor, a builder of highways and dams, a man who had poured concrete for the Boulder Dam and the Bonneville Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam, the largest construction projects in human history at the time of their completion. He thought in terms of flow, of throughput, of the systematic elimination of bottlenecks. When the United States Maritime Commission approached him in 1940 about building ships for the British government under the Lend-Lease program, Kaiser looked at the problem the way he had always looked at large construction challenges: not as a craft tradition to be honored, but as a production problem to be solved. The Liberty ship itself was British in concept but American in execution. Officially designated the EC-2SC-1 cargo vessel, it was deliberately unglamorous. Naval architects had designed it to be easily constructed, easily maintained, and easily replaced. It was welded rather than riveted, a significant innovation, which meant that prefabricated sections could be assembled simultaneously in different parts of a yard, and then joined together on the slipway in a fraction of the time a traditionally built ship would require. It was designed to carry 10,800 deadweight tons of cargo: tanks, aircraft, ammunition, canned food, steel, fuel, locomotives, medical supplies. It was emphatically not beautiful. It was 441 feet long, 57 feet in beam, and powered by a triple expansion steam engine that gave it a service speed of 11 knots. The German Navy, which prided itself on technical precision and engineering refinement, would have found it blunt, utilitarian, almost insulting in its simplicity. That simplicity was its genius. In the summer of 1941, Kaiser applied mass assembly line production techniques to the construction of these ships at his 4 Richmond yards, a process borrowed not from any naval tradition, but from the automotive industry, and from his own experience building infrastructure at continental scale. Parts were prefabricated at inland factories across the United States and shipped to the yards by rail. Steel sections arrived already cut and shaped. Welders worked in shifts around the clock, 7 days a week, their torches burning in the night with a blue-white flame that was visible from the hills above Richmond long after midnight. The welding torch. Remember it. It will return. That torch, held in hands wearing leather gloves, held by men who had been farmers 6 months earlier, by women who had been secretaries and school teachers, by Black Americans who had migrated from the Deep South seeking wages that the Jim Crow economy had denied them, by Mexican Americans, by immigrant hands from every corner of the Republic. That torch was the sound and the light of a democracy producing its way out of a crisis. It did not care about ideology. It did not care about the elegance of the vessel being built. It cared only about the continuous, methodical application of heat and metal and labor to the problem of replacement. In 1941, the first Liberty ships required approximately 244 days to build, from keel laying to delivery. That figure was already dramatically lower than British yards, but Kaiser did not treat it as an achievement. Yet he treated it as an opening position in a negotiation with time. By 1942, the average construction time at Kaiser's Richmond yards had fallen to 105 days. By late 1942 and into 1943, that average had fallen further still, to 56 days, to 42 days. At the height of production, Kaiser's yards were launching a new Liberty ship at a rate of more than one every 10 days per shipway. And then, on November 8, 1942, Kaiser staged what might be the most audacious act of industrial theater in the entire history of warfare. His yard in Richmond began constructing a Liberty ship, S. Robert E. Peary, as a deliberate demonstration of what American mass production could achieve when it dispensed with every traditional constraint. The keel was laid at 12:01 in the morning. 250,000 individual parts, at weighing approximately 14 million pounds in total, were assembled in sequence by round-the-clock shifts of workers who moved through the yard like the cells of a single enormous organism. Prefabricated sections were lowered into position by cranes, welded, inspected, fitted. The work did not stop for meals or weather or darkness. 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after the keel was laid, the SS Robert E. Peary was launched into the waters of San Francisco Bay. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. A 7,176 gross-ton ocean-going cargo vessel, capable of crossing the Atlantic fully laden, had been built from raw components in less time than it takes for a transatlantic voyage. The news reached Berlin. It reached Lorient, where Donitz kept his headquarters. And then for those who understood what it meant, who understood that this was not a stunt but a demonstration of systemic capacity, that the Peary was not an anomaly but a calibration point, a proof of what was already happening at scale across 18 American shipyards, the number 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes carried a meaning that no propaganda office could adequately neutralize. Because the average German Type 7 U-boat required between 10 and 14 months to build. A Type 9 required longer. Every submarine that the Allied forces sank represented a year or more of German industrial effort, a crew of 40 to 50 men, and a construction cost that could not be easily replaced. Every Liberty ship that the same U-boat sank was being replaced, at American shipyards, right now, around the clock, by women in welding masks and men who had never seen the sea, in 6 weeks. The arithmetic of the tonnage war had reversed itself. To understand the full weight of this reversal, one must look at the numbers as they accumulated through 1942 and into 1943 with the relentlessness of a tide. In 1941, American shipyards launched 14 Liberty ships. The program was still assembling itself, still learning its rhythms. In 1942, American shipyards launched 597 Liberty ships. By 1943, that number had climbed to 792. In the 4 years of the program, between 1941 and 1945, 18 American shipyards built 2,710 Liberty ships, an average of 3 ships every 2 days, easily the largest number of ships ever produced under a single construction program in human history. Consider that figure against the tonnage war's mathematics. We'll consider it against the German requirement of 700,000 tons sunk per month to achieve the strategic strangulation of Allied supply lines. Consider it against the fact that a single Liberty ship could carry 156,000 boxes of .30 caliber ammunition, 234 million rounds, that a single Liberty ship could carry entire locomotives, that a single Liberty ship could carry enough canned food to feed a division for months, that a single Liberty ship, delivered to a British port, represented not merely a vessel, but the contents of every factory, every farm, every industrial process that had contributed to its cargo. The U-boat could sink the ship. It could not sink the capacity that produced its replacement. Meanwhile, the workforce that was building these ships was itself a historical phenomenon that the German command could not have modeled from its operational charts. Between 1940 and 1944, the American female labor force grew to 19 million workers, more than a third of the entire civilian workforce. At Kaiser's Richmond yards alone, a total of 90,000 workers were employed at peak production, and eventually one-third of that workforce were women. At other yards, the proportion was higher, up to 60% female at some facilities. These were women who had never welded before 1941, who had never operated a rivet gun or read a technical blueprint. They were trained. They were organized. They were productive at a rate that astonished even the industrial managers who employed them. Black workers from the American South, migrants from Mexico, some first-generation immigrants from Eastern Europe and the Philippines, all of them were drawn into this enormous productive organism by the wages it offered and the urgency of the moment. The American shipbuilding workforce was not, by any definition, a uniformly treated or equitable community. Racial discrimination was real and documented. Segregated facilities existed alongside integrated production lines. The social contradictions of American democracy were present in the yards as they were everywhere else. But the machinery of production did not distinguish between the hands that held the welding torch. It simply measured their output, and their output was staggering. This was the thing that Dönitz's tonnage war could not account for. The democratic principle, imperfectly applied but enormously powerful, is that a society which draws on the productive potential of all its members, regardless of gender, regardless of origin, generates a force multiplier that a hierarchical, racially stratified industrial state cannot match. The welding torch burned, night and day, in 3 shifts, on both coasts, in yards that had been vacant mudflats 18 months before. In the North Atlantic in the first months of 1943, the U-boat commanders who were still alive were beginning to encounter something they had not fully prepared for. The convoys they hunted were no longer slow, poorly escorted processions of merchant vessels moving in naive columns. They were organized formations now, protected by growing numbers of escort vessels equipped with increasingly sophisticated detection systems. The high-frequency direction-finding equipment, known to the Allies as Huff Duff, could identify the position of a U-boat the moment it transmitted a radio signal. Air cover had expanded, with very long-range Liberator bombers beginning to close the mid-Atlantic air gap that had previously been a sanctuary for the wolf packs. The centimetric radar being fitted to escort vessels and aircraft could detect a surfaced U-boat in darkness and in fog at ranges that made the nighttime surface attack, the U-boat commander's most reliable tactic, increasingly suicidal. But more than the technology, more than the tactical innovations, what the U-boat commanders were encountering in 1943 was the consequence of math they could not overcome. They could sink ships. They had always been able to sink ships. The aces among them were still effective, was still dangerous, still capable of catastrophic individual engagements. In March 1943, in what would prove to be the last great U-boat offensive of the war, German submarines sank 567,000 tons of Allied shipping in a single month, very close to Dönitz's required threshold, close enough that Allied commanders in London and Washington genuinely feared the tonnage war might still be won by Germany. The crisis meetings at the Admiralty were conducted with a gravity that reflected genuine strategic uncertainty. But American shipyards had already launched more tonnage in replacement that March than the U-boats had sunk, and they would do so again the following month. And the month after that, the balance had shifted, and it had shifted permanently. Just because the capacity behind the balance was not a peak achievement to be sustained, it was a floor, and it was rising. Then came May 1943, the month that the U-boat crews would remember in the memoirs and testimonies of those who survived it, not as a defeat in any single engagement, but as a sudden, terrible dawning. In 31 days, Allied forces destroyed 41 U-boats. 41. In a single month. Dönitz lost more submarines in May 1943 than he had lost in the entire year of 1941. On May 24th, the Admiral, facing numbers that could not be argued with and cannot be massaged by ideology, issued the order that no commander who had built his career on offensive doctrine ever wants to issue. He withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic. The submarines that pulled away from the convoy routes in that last week of May and headed for French ports did so in a silence that was different in quality from the silence of a tactical pause. It was the silence of a strategic reversal. Dönitz himself, writing in his memoir 10 years and 20 days, with the careful understatement of a man reconstructing defeat for a historical record, acknowledged that May 1943 represented the effective failure of the tonnage war strategy. The U-boat arm, he wrote, had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. He would continue sending submarines into the ocean. He would continue demanding that his crews, boys now, boys born in 1925 and 1926, boys who had joined the submarine service because their older brothers had been heroes in 1940, go back out onto that water and face those odds. But the arithmetic that had once pointed toward victory now pointed only at mortality. Of the 39,000 men who served in Germany's U-boat force during the entire war, 27,490 were killed in action or lost at sea. A casualty rate of 70%, the highest fatality rate of any military service in the German armed forces. Of the more than 1,000 submarines deployed operationally, 783 were sunk. The boys who sailed in the last years of the war, who descended into the depths of the North Atlantic in 1943 and 1944, when the survival statistics had become almost incomprehensible, did so knowing, on some level, what the numbers said. Their captains knew. Their officers knew. Dönitz, reviewing his weekly reports from Lorient, could not have not known. They went anyway. This is not a small thing, and it should not be dismissed. Yet the courage required to operate a submarine in the North Atlantic in 1944, when the kill ratio had so thoroughly reversed that an operational patrol was statistically more likely to end in death than in a successful return, is not the courage of men who believed they were winning. It is the courage, or the despair, or the obedience, depending on how one reads it, of men caught inside a system that had already calculated their expendability. What they could not know, what no German naval intelligence report had adequately conveyed to the men sitting in the diesel-smelling control rooms of their Type 7s, was the full picture of what was being done to their arithmetic in Richmond and Baltimore and Portland, Maine, and Savannah, Georgia and Houston, Texas, and Los Angeles, California. What they could not know was the torchlight. As the three shifts, the women in welding masks, the prefabricated sections coming in by rail from factories in Pittsburgh and Detroit and Akron, the hulls growing on the slipways in days instead of weeks, descending into the water with the practiced regularity of something rolling off an assembly line, because that is precisely what it was. In the autumn of 1943, German military intelligence analysts reviewing the production figures for American shipbuilding, numbers they had accumulated through intercepts and neutral nation observers and the testimony of prisoners, arrived at conclusions that were reportedly met with disbelief in some quarters of the high command. The assessments showed not merely that American yards were building ships faster than U-boats were sinking them, but that the production margin was widening every quarter. That the 2,710-ship Liberty program was not the ceiling of American capacity, but one component within a broader emergency shipbuilding program that also included victory ships, tankers, attack transports, and landing craft, a total of more than 5,000 ships built in American yards during the war years. 5,000 ships. The figure is difficult to absorb in its full meaning. It represents the mobilization of a nation's industrial geography, every river mouth, every protected bay, every coastal city with access to rail lines and steel supply and a labor force that could be trained. It represents the conversion of civilian industry at a speed and scale that had never been attempted before in the history of organized warfare. It represents, at its most elemental, the answer to a question that Donitz's tonnage war had implicitly asked of the Allied powers: can you build faster than we can destroy? The answer, spoken not in words but in the grinding of cranes and the arc of welding torches and the splash of hull after hull entering the water, was yes. Yes, at a rate you cannot match. Yes, at a scale your arithmetic did not account for. Yes, because the arithmetic you built your strategy around was an arithmetic of destruction, and what you failed to calculate was the arithmetic of creation, which, when organized and motivated and sufficiently funded, can always outpace the arithmetic of destruction, because creation multiplies and destruction can only subtract. A single Liberty ship, fully loaded, some carried in its 5 cargo holds a condensed version of the American productive system. Tanks built in Detroit, ammunition filled in St. Louis, canned goods processed in Chicago, aircraft assembled in California, medical supplies packaged in Connecticut. It carried the output of factories that had themselves been built in a matter of months, staffed by workers who had been drawn from across the continent by the same emergency mobilization that had transformed Richmond's mudflat into the most productive shipbuilding complex in American history. When a U-boat sank a Liberty ship, it removed one expression of that system from the ocean. It did not remove the system. The system was already building the replacement. The welding torch burned in Richmond. It burned in Baltimore, from where the Bethlehem steel yards were assembling hulls at their own relentless pace. It burned in the delta marshes of Louisiana and in the salt air of the Maine coast. It burned in the hands of people whose names would not appear in military histories, whose contributions would not be commemorated on war memorials, whose presence in the yards had been an improvised answer to an emergency rather than a planned component of any grand strategy. The women who welded those hulls, who held that torch in their leather-gloved hands at 2 a.m. in the middle of the Pacific Coast winter, who had been secretaries and housewives and salesgirls a year before, and who were now the productive core of a shipbuilding program that was deciding the Battle of the Atlantic, did not think of themselves as making ideological statements. They thought of themselves as doing a job, but the job they were doing was, in its aggregate, the most profound possible refutation of the ideology that had sent those U-boats out into the ocean. The ideology of scarcity, of hierarchy, of the strong consuming the weak. The ideology that had calculated the tonnage war on the assumption that the Allied powers could be bled dry, that there was a finite supply of ships and cargo and men, and that it could be exhausted. What the torch refuted, night after night, in the light-saturated yards of a nation fully roused, was the assumption of finite capacity. What it said, without words, without ceremony, it was that American abundance was not a fixed quantity to be depleted, but a generative force to be repeatedly expressed, that the nation which had built the Hoover Dam and the Golden Gate Bridge and the interstate highway system was not going to be outproduced by a country whose strategic planning had never seriously accounted for what democratic industrial mobilization looked like from the inside. The U-boat captains who survived the war, a minority, as the mathematics make clear, carried particular memories out of the ocean with them. The veterans who left memoirs and gave post-war interviews spoke with a consistent grammar of disillusionment. Not the disillusionment of men who had been insufficiently brave or skilled, but the disillusionment of men who had discovered, in the worst possible circumstances, is that the war they had been sent to fight was not the war that was actually being waged. They had been sent to fight a battle of attrition in which the productive capacity of the enemy would be the decisive variable. They had assumed, because their command had assumed, because their intelligence apparatus had assumed, that this variable was bounded, that there was a ceiling on what America could build, that the ceiling could be reached if the sinkings were maintained at the required pace. There was no ceiling. That was what they found. Not a ceiling pushed higher by emergency measures, not a ceiling being pressed against by an industrial system working at extraordinary effort. No ceiling at all. A horizon. A receding horizon of productive capacity that moved away from them with every month they spent in the Atlantic, it growing in proportion to their losses, outpacing every calculation they had made about the nature and limits of their enemy. One has to sit with that for a moment. The experience of a U-boat commander in late 1943, watching his patrol reports against the weekly shipping construction figures that were beginning to make their way into German naval assessments, that experience must have carried within it a particular quality of strategic vertigo. The realization that the arithmetic of the war had not merely shifted against you, but had been, from some point in 1942 forward, running in a direction you could not reverse, regardless of how many ships you sank. That the mathematics of industrial democracy, when fully mobilized, produce an irreversible momentum. That the welding torch, held in 1,000,000 anonymous hands across an entire continent, is a weapon of a type for which submarine tactics offer no defense. By the spring of 1944, the men sailing from the French Atlantic ports in U-boats were doing so against odds that the original architects of the tonnage war would not have recognized as survivable. The U-boat fleet that had entered 1942 with the confidence of proven predators was now a force conducting what Dönitz called, in one of his more candid assessments, a sacrifice for the larger war effort, a hope that continued operations might pin down Allied anti-submarine resources and delay the inevitable. The men in the steel tubes were no longer the aces of the first happy time. They were boys on their first patrols. They were crew members who had been told that the new technologies being fitted to their submarines, the Schnorkel air mast, the acoustic torpedo, that the improved radar detection equipment would restore the balance. They were men living inside a hope that the production figures had already rendered mathematically hollow. Of the U-boats that departed on operational patrols in 1944, the vast majority did not return. The survival rate had inverted completely from the early years. Where once the U-boat arm had been one of the most decorated and celebrated branches of the German military, it had become by 1944 a formation whose operational statistics more closely resembled those of a condemned formation than a functioning naval force. What killed them was not any single technology or any single tactical innovation, though both mattered. What killed the tonnage war was the welding torch. Yet it was the 3-shift schedule in Richmond and the prefabricated keel sections arriving by rail, and the woman in the welding mask who had been a secretary in Oakland a year before and who was now, on this particular shift, fastening a section of hull plating to a frame member that would become part of a ship that would cross the Atlantic in 6 weeks, carrying Sherman tanks and canned goods and aviation fuel to ports that the U-boat arm could not close because there were simply too many ships, and more being launched every day, and the arithmetic had reversed itself, and it was not going back. On September 2nd, 1945, the Second World War ended. In the years that followed, the Liberty ships were gradually retired from service, their unglamorous hulls no longer required for the emergency that had brought them into existence. Yet many were sold to foreign merchant fleets, some were scrapped, a handful survived into the present as museum ships, among them the SS Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco, maintained in operational condition as a monument to the program and to the workers who built it. The Jeremiah O'Brien sits now at Pier 45 in San Francisco. its gray-painted hull and utilitarian superstructure unchanged in their essential character from the day it was launched. It is not a beautiful ship by any conventional maritime standard. It has the proportions of function rather than elegance. Its lines are practical rather than graceful. It looks, as one historian wrote, like exactly what it was: an emergency solution to an existential problem, designed to be built quickly, used fully, and replaced without ceremony. But there is something in its plainness that carries its own kind of weight, because what that plainness represented in the winter of 1942 and the spring of 1943 and the summer of 1944, when the U-boat war was being decided not in spectacular fleet engagements, but in the relentless, unglamorous arithmetic of production versus destruction. What it represented was the proposition that a democracy's most profound strategic resource is not its military hardware or its tactical doctrine, but its productive capacity, its ability to organize the labor of ordinary people toward extraordinary ends, and its ability to weld the ordinary hands of ordinary citizens into the hull of a vessel that carries not merely cargo, but the material expression of a society's will to survive and to supply its allies and to keep the ocean lanes open against any force that seeks to close them. The welding torch, the blue-white flame in the Richmond night, in the hands of a woman who had never held a torch before 1941, in the hands of a man who had driven a tractor in Kansas in 1940, in the hands of an immigrant, a migrant, an American of every possible origin and description, burning through the darkness in 3 shifts, 7 days a week, building ships that could not be sunk fast enough, that could never be sunk fast enough, because by the time the torpedo had already struck and the cargo had already descended into the depths of the North Atlantic, the replacement was already on the slipway, already taking shape under the arc of another torch, already 6 weeks from the water. Karl Dönitz built his war on an equation. The equation was correct in its variables, but wrong in its constants, because the constants he had assumed for American productive capacity were not constants at all. They were starting points. They were the first note of a drumbeat, not the German Paukenschlag he had imagined, but a different drumbeat entirely. Deeper, wider, the sound of an entire nation's industrial civilization coming to full voice. He heard it, eventually, in the Atlantic, in the spring of 1943, in the silence after he withdrew his wolf packs from the convoy routes, in the numbers in his weekly reports, yet in the casualty figures that kept climbing regardless of the courage of the men who generated them. He heard it, and he understood what it meant, that the war in the ocean had not been decided by a battle, or by a weapon, or by a tactical innovation, but by the patient, methodical, unstoppable application of a civilization's productive will to the problem of replacement. That the ship he sank on Monday would be on the slipway by Wednesday and on the ocean by Thursday week. He could not sink it fast enough. No one could. There is a larger truth in this, one that extends beyond the specific contours of the Battle of the Atlantic and the specific mathematics of the Liberty Ship program. And it is a truth about the nature of abundance and its relationship to freedom, about what it means to organize the productive potential of a society that extends the dignity of labor to those it previously excluded, that says to the woman and the immigrant and the migrant and the worker with no prior training, here is a torch, here is a wage, here is a ship that needs building, and what you build will matter. The German tonnage war assumed that the ocean could be made a barrier, that if enough ships burned, the supply lines would fail and the democracies would capitulate, not to a military defeat in the field, but to the simple exhaustion of their capacity to move material across water. Yet it was a strategy built on the premise that the Allied nations were finite in their resources and bounded in their productive capability, that they could be bled dry. What the Liberty Ship program demonstrated, in numbers too large to dispute, was that the premise was wrong. That a democratic society, when genuinely mobilized, when it draws on the full range of its human capacity rather than a privileged subset of it, does not reach a ceiling. It reaches a horizon, and the horizon keeps moving. Every ship that slid down the ways at Richmond and into the dark water of San Francisco Bay was a refutation of that premise. Every ship that arrived at Liverpool or Murmansk or Casablanca, carrying tanks and ammunition and canned food, was a message, though no one framed it in those terms. Show to every intelligence analyst in Berlin who was trying to calculate when the Allied supply lines would break. The message was delivered in the language that grand strategy ultimately must be spoken in, not the language of speeches or manifestos, but the language of arithmetic. And it said, simply, clearly, and without sentimentality, there is no ceiling. There is only the torch, and the hands that hold it, and the ships that keep coming. In the end, the U-boat captains were not defeated by a superior weapon, though the weapons used against them were formidable. They were not defeated by a superior tactic, though the tactics evolved with devastating effectiveness. They were defeated by something older and stranger and more fundamental than either. The productive surplus of a democracy that could not be exhausted, expressed in the blue-white light of a welding torch burning through the Pacific coast night, building ships faster than the ocean could swallow them. That light did not go out until the war was won. And then it did not go out either. It simply changed what it was building.